High modernism, bordering on surrealism, hits a kind of apex with Jorge Borges, who was one of the more interesting characters of the 20th century. He was born Jorge Francisco Isidoro Luis Borges Acevedo, known to the world as Jorge Borges, or just Borges, a supremely sophisticated and cultured gentleman of international disposition, let's say. Born in 1899, lived until 1986, a pretty good long life. Went blind by the time he was 50, 55, somewhere in there. And despite that, had a very long, successful career as a reader, a writer, a librarian, and a professor. He was born in Argentina, spent most of his young adulthood in Europe, primarily based in Switzerland, but traveled widely, and developed this international, global perspective for literature, for art, for philosophy, and for the somewhat troubling times he was living through. Imagine being based in Switzerland for the 20s and 30s and 40s, and what is going on around Switzerland, or perhaps just a little to the north. These things are significant. He wrote a fair amount throughout his life, despite his blindness, and much of it is brilliant. But it's probably the best thing that he's written, or the most notable thing, I would say, is a work of, or a collection of short stories called Ficciones. And these he wrote primarily throughout the 1940s. It came out in a short version first, and then a somewhat expanded version with more stories next, and really showed the depth and perception of this one particular artist and what he could do with language. And he's always been kind of a writer's writer, probably more accepted, more celebrated in circles of fellow artists than with the public at large, although he does enjoy, especially in the Spanish-speaking world, he does enjoy a considerable following and fandom. But probably one of the more interesting stories of that collection is called The Library at Babel. Babel, of course, being the story in the Bible, the city that built a tower where God started to feel that mankind was starting to encroach upon his realm, the sky, and so God comes down, or God from above decides to confuse the languages of the people working on this project, essentially taking the one uniform language of humanity and then diversifying it and complicating it so that people could not talk to one another, and thus they could not achieve anything. And obviously there are all sorts of interesting metaphorical significances to dig into there. But it is the story of the library. This library in this city that is infinite but not infinite, and a compendium of every thought, every book, every publication, every word ever printed. And it is kind of a nightmare. It is kind of out there, let's say. It starts fairly humbly. It starts fairly simply. The universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite and perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries with vast air shafts between, surrounded by very low railings. From any of the hexagons one can see interminably the upper and lower floors. The distribution of the galleries is invariable. 20 shelves, five long shelves per side, cover all the sides except two. Their height, which is the distance from floor to ceiling, scarcely exceeds that of a normal bookcase. To the left and right of the one hallway, there are two small closets. In the first, one may sleep standing up. In the other, satisfy one's fecal necessities. And in the English, I just really love fecal necessities. It's translated, but come on, it still hits the laugh. This is odd. Certainly, you're trying to imagine all these hexagons and stuff, these six-sided shapes, and trying to see, well, how would this fit in? What is going on here? But it is laid out in the narrative, in the narration, very logically, very simply. It's almost as if you were being introduced to something. Okay, this is the new world that we're coming into, and they are building it very slowly and very methodically. And there is a certain comfort to that where we can go along. This is coming at the very beginning. And so Borges is introducing you to this world very gradually, just saying, come on, it's a little weird, but yes, we can all make sense of this. We're just going to take a very simple, concrete, documentary look at everything, and everything will work out. He writes further, also, through here passes a spiral stairway which sinks abysmally and soars upward to remote distances. Now here he is, again, sort of playing with space, but hinting at some weirdness to it. A spiral stairway which goes into the abyss. I think he's playing on the word abyss two different ways here. The sense that it is going down into an unknown depth, but also there is a sense of dread. There is a sense of it being abysmal. That is, I think, very clear in the suggestion of that one word, and soars upward to remote distances. So there is a kind of surreal, not real characteristic to this seemingly real place. The line between reality and unreality is very, very blurred. The line between objective, simple, noticeable truth and something quite bizarre is obviously in flux here. Like all men of the library, I have traveled in my youth and have wandered in search of a book, perhaps the catalog of catalogs. Again, we're moving through the story and we're seeing these little suggestions here and there. It's like, okay, well, is it a library? Is it a real library? The catalog of catalogs sounds bizarre. A compendium of catalogs. Perhaps it is a infinite document. A catalog of catalogs is a hint at, the medieval trope of the book of God, the book of the universe, the book of all creation, that we can understand if we just read it attentively enough. Through the book of God, we can know the mind of God. Through the book of God, which is written in the physical reality around us, we can read, understand, intuit a truth beyond human faculties generally. He writes, the idealists argue that the hexagonal rooms are a necessary form of absolute space, or at least of our intuition of space. They reason that a triangular or pentagonal room is inconceivable. These people are starting to debate things that make very little sense. The inconceivable, a triangular or pentagonal room, but hexagonal makes perfect sense. The people are starting to argue about arcania, I would say here. The logic of it is starting to become more and more frayed and attenuated. The mystics claim that their ecstasy reveals to them a circular chamber containing a great circular book, whose spine is continuous and which follows the complete circle of the walls. But their testimony is suspect, their words obscure. This cyclical book is God. We're back to the image of God as a book, the image of the universe as a book. Notably, this is the mystics. The idealists and the mystics are being sight-checked here, and they're debating what really makes very little sense. the ecstasy in their ecstasy. Is that a rational state of mind? No, they are mystics. They believe in being or in visions, and having ecstatic visions reveals to them a circular chamber containing a great circular book. Well, what does that look like, and how would that work? I'm not sure exactly how you would read something like that. The logic of this is getting more and more strained, and we are seeing this physical reality that was laid out so clearly, I would argue, in those first sentences, is becoming more and more opaque and troubling. When it was proclaimed that the library contained all books, the first impression was one of extravagant happiness. All men felt themselves to be masters of an intact and secret pleasure. There was no personal or world problem whose eloquent solution did not exist in some hexagon. The universe was justified. The universe suddenly usurped the unlimited dimensions of hope. At that time, a great deal was said about the vindications, books of apology and prophecy, which vindicated for all time the acts of every man in the universe and retained prodigious arcana for its future. A great sense of hopefulness. And remember, Borges was a librarian. He did like libraries, but there is a kind of pompous hope or faith, I would argue, in the possibilities of human knowledge, in the scope of human understanding. There is a somewhat troubling tone to this, however. The vindications, books of apology and prophecy, which vindicated for all time the acts of every man in the universe and retained prodigious arcana for his future. This is starting to sound nasty. This is starting to sound troubling. This is starting to sound aggressive. There's some problems here. These pilgrims disputed in the narrow corridors, proffered dark curses, strangled each other on the divine stairways, flung the deceptive books into the air shafts, met their deaths cast down in a similar fashion by the inhabitants of remote regions. Others went mad. This is starting to become more of a nightmare vision. This is starting to become more of a dystopia from the utopian aspirations at the first, when they first saw, oh, a library that is infinite, that has all the books ever written. What a wonderful thing. But suddenly people are arguing about it. People have different perspectives, different ideas about what the books mean, perhaps, or what books should be in there. And this becomes a point of great contention. At that time, it was also hoped that a clarification of humanity's basic mysteries, the origin of the library and of time, might be found at that time. So long ago, it seems like already, but it is a prophecy of doom. This is an idealistic, romanticized past that they are perhaps conjuring here. There are official searchers, inquisitors. Sounds like Inquisition, personally. I have seen them in the performance of their function. They always arrive extremely tired from their journeys. They speak of a broken stairway which almost killed them. They talk with a librarian of galleries and stairs. Sometimes they pick up the nearest volume and leaf through it, looking for infamous words. Obviously, no one expects them to discover anything. These people are going through books. These people are looking for infamous words. These are book investigators, book persecutors, let's just remember this is coming out in the early 40s in Switzerland, book burners, perhaps. Others, inversely, believed that it was fundamental to eliminate useless works. They invaded the hexagons, showed credentials that were not always false, leafed through a volume with displeasure, and condemned whole shelves. Their hygienic, ascetic furor caused the senseless perdition of millions of books. Perdition is fire. So yeah, we are at the burning of books. We are at people who are just destroying books willy-nilly. It is an infinite library, and yet these people are destroying the books. But there is some hope for that, and in it makes it even, but the hope is even more convoluted and, quite frankly, troubling. He lists one, the library is so enormous that any reduction of human origin is infinitesimal. The other, every copy is unique, irreplaceable, but since the library is total, there are always several 100,000 imperfect facsimiles, works which differ only in a letter or a comma. So you can get rid of a book, but it's still always kind of there, but maybe it's a little different. So is there any one objective truth then? Is there any accessible objective truth? Then everything is lost in this kind of profusion, and human effort, human intention, human purpose is pointless within that. And notice as well this notion of an infinitesimal library, an infinitesimal resource. This is coming about in the 1940s or so, a good deal before the so-called information age. But this is obviously applicable to the internet. Critics have pointed this out, that the idea of infinite information, a field of information in which you can get lost forever among the good and the bad, a profusion of stuff that you cannot find your way through, that is not unfamiliar to us today. And this is starting to become apparent in this very Kafkaesque, vague, abstract, high modernist way, where we can start to intuit the internet in something well before the internet was ever a thing, where the ideas are embedded in this text from the 1940s, but because of its opacity, because of its difficulty, its open nature, we can impute new meanings to it. Very significant. And this is not the easiest text to read. This is a very short story, but it's not really a story. It's taken originally from an essay that Borges had written a couple of years earlier, and it has very little actual narrative going on here. The narrative elements are slim, to say the very least, which is another example of high modernism, I would say. But there is some craft going on. He is not just expounding. Again, look at how specific the very beginning is, with these physical properties described in very concrete terms. 20 shelves, 5 long shelves per side, cover all the sides except 2. Their height, which is the distance from floor to ceiling, scarcely exceeds that of a normal bookcase. This is a measurable, knowable world. This is objectively clear in its vision, however weird the object of that vision is. But then you look at the very end. The library will endure, illuminated, solitary, infinite, perfectly motionless, equipped with precious volumes, useless, incorruptible, secret. What the hell does that mean? It's so vague. It is, you have no idea what that is at that point. And so the story goes from one of a certain amount of concrete description and ends up dissolving into the ether of unknowability. And the very end. The library is unlimited and cyclical. If an eternal traveler were to cross it in any direction, after centuries, he would see that the same volumes were repeated in the same disorder, which, thus repeated, would be an order, the order. My solitude is gladdened by this elegant hope. Well, is that hope? Is that hope that it's just so random? Now, in a totalitarian state like Germany, to the direct north of Switzerland, you can see him taking some solace that, well, okay, everything the Nazis are doing is just a drop in the bucket. They're not going to be able to roll back human civilization that much. They can't shape something that enormous and organic. But it's also a kind of sense of defeatism. My solitude is gladdened by this elegant hope. Elegant sounds so ephemeral, sounds so aesthetic, sounds so unrealistic. And it is, after all, just a hope that even in the orderly destruction of order, the forces of disorder can only do so much. The forces of chaos, if that's all we have to hope for, all we have to grab onto, well, is that enough?